Welcome to Disclosure with Dr. Stephen Greer. In this episode, we discuss the forces against contact and disclosure. Dr. Greer, welcome.
Thank you. Love being with you.
Absolutely. Dr. Greer, in the mid to late 1990s, you had an experience at Crestone, Mount Shasta, and Joshua Tree. Can you expand on those experiences and tell us about them?
Well, we began doing more of the CE5 contact work. And of course, on one track, we're trying to resolve the secrecy issues. The other, we keep the process going where I'm training people to become ambassadors to other planetary systems and the CE5 contact protocol. So we began having amazing contact. And if you look at the Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind documentary, it's the tip of the iceberg of all the things that happen. But we started having more and more direct contact with various civilizations up on Mount Shasta and Crestone, Colorado, in Joshua Tree. And these were amazing events where mass witness craft would come over, would be signaling to us, objects would partially materialize in the field with us, people would have direct ET contact experiences, and on and on. Now, as that's going on, well, of course, at the same time, we're working to try to resolve this crisis inside the government that's really transnational outside the government in many ways, at least for most government officials. And those events began to be more and more noted by the intelligence community because they're monitoring those things. And they certainly knew when we would have an ET object that would appear, and they don't have to fly in from space. They can just materialize, quote unquote, in this area of space where you are, and often even come up from underground. And we have systems in space that can track objects 25 miles into the Earth, by the way. So those were being noted, and then often were attempts to interfere with it. So like at Mount Shasta, we had an event take place where there were aircraft overhead as soon as we had a contact event where a massive object that was out in space. It was so large that it was seen from Vancouver all the way to LA that we had vectored in. And as it came over, we signaled to it and it turned and signaled to us. To give an idea how big it was way up in space, but it was 2/3 the size of the triangle in Pegasus. And as I said, so large that it was seen up and down the West Coast. And it came when we were doing this contact protocol that included a meditation and prayer for the healing of the Earth. And so we knew it was the ET saying, yes, this is exactly what we want to join you with energetically and in consciousness.
Right.
But then immediately afterwards, we had helicopters over us. We had jet fighters over us. We had all kinds of people. We had boots on the ground, people that we had night scopes could see coming through the woods in camo, coming off a military vehicle. So there was all this sort of cat and mouse game going on around that time. And there were some really nasty directional energy weapons that were pointed at me and a small team that went to White Sands, where we were doing a CE5 contact to sort of clear the Akashic record, the energy of what had happened at the atomic bomb site near there in White Sands missile range in New Mexico. So these things began to sort of escalate. So all of that contact, as we were training more and more thousands of people all over the world to make contact, the intelligence community was engaging in all kinds of countermeasures, and especially with people who were really starting to dig into this. I think that it was a time from 1991 till 1998. I had been approached every year by a man if I wanted protection, and I said no, and that was a mistake. So in 98, we corrected that after some really tragic events happened to my team. And that's been resolved since then. Since 1998, no one has been threatened, no one's been harmed. But there was a time there that was very difficult. And as we were moving this forward, there were some rather nasty folks who have directional energy weapons and other means to induce disease states. Now, these are non-local. They're what are called scalar, faster than the speed of light. And that can be used to heal. They can also be used to harm. And so pretty much the same month, Congressman Schiff, who was really pushing on the Roswell event, and myself, and Sherry Adamak, who helped me at the very beginning of the CE5 contact effort in '91. She got involved, all got aggressive metastatic cancers and died. I didn't die. I almost did. I have a big scar here and there. And I had metastatic malignant melanoma, which is the deadliest of all. And I was supposed to die first, we thought would, but it turned out Sherry passed away. So, and then tragically, just before that, in the mid-'90s, the former director of the CIA, Bill Colby, had approached a member of my board and was going to offer one of these, a solid-state, zero-point free energy device, and about $50 million in seed funding to get it out. And I didn't like the fact that at the time I was told it was a senior intelligence official. I didn't know it was Mr. Colby, the CIA Director Colby, who was retired. He was getting up in years. He was fed up with the secrecy. He was sickened by what was happening to the planet. But I thought it should have been a very public event, because if it's done in the public, as I said early on, I was told by a early intelligence guy, get on Larry King, get on these shows, or you're a dead man walking. I'm quoting. So I didn't like the way it was this sort of skullduggery, but that's the way he wanted to do it. So the week he was supposed to meet with the member of my board, that meeting never happened. They found him floating south of DC in the Potomac River. And his close friend who set it up told me, yes, that was a wet works. Now his son thought he committed suicide. Other people said it was a boating accident. You know, it was a death-defying period, and it was taught me that, you know, if someone offers you help, you take it, even if it seems unsavory. So what was put in place at that time after this? The person who came to me every year offering, he called it executive protection. So we have had no problem since then, since 1998. We had to also change directions. We were trying to do this through the White House and the Congress. I concluded those people were never going to do this properly. And that was the inception of the Public Disclosure Project that people know about. But in the event, the night that Sherry Adamak passed away, she introduced me to this ET named Kindness. And Kindness, I call her Kindness, perfectly round head, not like our shape, and no pinna, no outside ears, very fine featured, beautiful eyes. And she was introduced to me by Sherry from the spirit world, and this was an ET that could go, of course, transdimensional, 3D, or when they're transdimensional, they're very close to the astral spirit world. That ET and her craft has appeared at every single CE5 contact event since 1998.
Wow. Without
exception.
Incredible.
Yeah, beautiful.
So what is the connection between Kindness and your team?
She is a senior interstellar diplomat. In those civilizations, it's your intelligence and your spiritual development and your empathy and all those. So when you talk about interstellar diplomats and people who contact humans from other star systems, that is the criterion. She's a very senior one in this sort of interplanetary coalition. I never got her proper name because to me she was like an avatar, a perfect kindliness. So kind, and so I just call her Kindness. We have many videos and pictures of the craft.
The craft is Kindness, or is Kindness in the craft?
In the craft.
In the craft,
yeah. But the craft is conscious with the awareness of the pilot.
The pilot, yeah.
We'll get into that later, you know, the integration of these technologies with consciousness and thought.
So Dr. Greer, you mentioned the Disclosure Project earlier and the things that led up to it almost coming into fruition. And then all of a sudden in 2001, you put out the Disclosure Project, but something happened during that event. Can you tell us what it was?
Yes, I mean, interestingly, the public doesn't know this. The entire event was jammed for the first hour, trying to get out of the National Press Club event, I'm sure by operatives within these USAPs. And as I mentioned, our people had seen them on the roof the night before in the wee hours. And we also had a great deal of interest in the major media. I mean, but I found out that the intelligence community contacted all the major networks and says, don't play this again, take this down, et cetera, and so on, which is why it was up on CNN and Headline News and various things, and then dropped. And I got very detailed information on why that was torpedoed, because it wasn't just, oh, there's a UAP, we don't know where they are, where they're coming from, or what they are. It was very detailed information. Yeah. You know, people who had been involved with the ET bodies, on the reverse engineering, on all kinds of, you know, very specific information, all of which were credentialed people who had had top secret clearances, yeah, et cetera, and so on. So in the way, it was a transition phase from us deciding in 98 that late 97, 98, when I was, you know, battling for my life, Sherry was, that, you know, we needed to take this to the people. Now, here's why. I needed from 91 or 92 until 98 to establish the criminal, illegal nature of these projects. And this is an important step. We created something called an unless otherwise directed memo. And that's my military advisor said, look, you know, you have to, you know, do something formally where you notify the heads of all the agencies and government departments that you're going to go forward based on an assessment, and that unless otherwise directed, my assessment is correct. That's what a UNOD letter is. It's a very specific tactic. And so we created this, and we have it on our website, and it went to the heads of all the agencies, return receipt requested, we have a record of it. And in this letter it says, here's our assessment. I have briefed the following officials that we've talked about, right, and members of Congress, and senior people around the president, and they have been denied access to these projects. Therefore, those projects are illegal, they're unconstitutional, and the national security oaths and non-disclosure agreements that all personnel have signed are null and void. We're vitiating them, we're vacating them. And unless otherwise directed, by the end of January 1998, we're going to move forward with top secret documents that are not declassified, top secret witnesses who did sign non-disclosure agreements, and exonerate them, and they cannot be prosecuted under any of the laws of the United States because the projects are illegal, and an illegal project cannot use the law to defend itself. Now, to this date, as of the sitting right here, no one from the government, even an unacknowledged special access project, has said, you're wrong. Because if they said I was wrong, I'll say, prove it. Yeah. I can take this into court with our constitutional attorneys and prove the opposite. That in fact, these are illegal, rogue, unconstitutional projects. Right. So at that point, we, you know, wanted to give them a little bit of time. Then we organized the 2001 National Press Club event, and that was, you know, a big undertaking.
Even though disclosure is like a drip by drip type of disclosure so far, and a lot of the people that have been involved, including yourself, may not be able to see the fruit of the labor. It's kind of like we're planting seeds for trees that are going to grow. We'll never sit in the shade of these trees. So how do you feel about that? What do you think is going to happen, and how many people do you think are going to be able to see this come to fruition?
Well, actually, the false disclosure is happening right now. The actual disclosure we did already. I mean, you know, we have hundreds of hours of videotape. On my YouTube channel, there's 70 top secret witnesses. The books, Unacknowledged and Disclosure, have all the transcripts and documents. Basically, that's been done. What people don't confuse is that they think it's going to be done by the president. And as I said, most of the presidents, even if they want to do this, are pretty much encouraged, and that's a mild word, not to. So, threatened. So, but most people know, you know, it was like Carol Rosin saw in the 1970s when she was Fairchild Industries, the first women executives in aerospace, a plan. She went into an office meeting, and there was a plan from going all the way forward through now of all these countries we were going to invade and attack. And there were names on there, like she didn't even know, Yemen and Iraq, and they weren't even on the radar in the mid-'70s, right, of anybody. And so this long-term strategic plan was mapped out back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And that includes staging and, this sort of threat from outer space that Wernher von Braun, who invented the rocket for Adolf Hitler, warned about on his deathbed. That was a deathbed warning from this guy. And I think that many of the people involved in that project knows that it's a multi-generational, long-term project to try to create a world, let's call it a unified world, but in the wrong way, in my opinion.
Yeah.
They want to unify the world in war and division instead of in peace and universal peace. I think it's 180 degrees opposite of where we should be going. So, but that's been a very long-term project of people who want to keep endless wars going, military-industrial spending, all this stuff. And the way they control the public is through fear. But remember, that's a long-term effort because you can't do that all at once.
Yeah.
It's like, the Nazis. It was years and years of blood libel and the Elders of Zion and all kinds of caricatures of Jewish people and what have you to do what they did. Well, basically, this is a much more expanded global version of that kind of thinking. And so there's been this long-term acculturation and disinformation project. So the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s up through now, that's when they started seeding this subject with all kinds of frightening caricatures of aliens. They launched what I call exo-racism, where there's, the good ETs, of course, look like someone from Norway, and the bad ones look different from us. I mean, this is prima facie, blatant racism. But the New Age UFO community just laps this up, thinking, oh, great, because they don't realize that within us is this tribal nature to be afraid of other. And that's what we have to go into higher consciousness to transcend, or we'll never make peace on this planet or in space. The big challenge of our time is going into not just human oneness, but universal consciousness and oneness. Because if you just unite the world, and we're all working together as a planet, but we're fighting another planetary civilization, this is not going forward. This is absolutely going way back to a time of utter destruction. So that's the agenda long-term of the intelligence community. Keep the technology secret, except the things we can monetize, like digital, chips and fiber optics and stuff. And let's get the people on board with this agenda of a threat from outer space. It's the biggest hoax ever committed in the known history of humanity.
So, Dr. Greer, in the same way that there's a lot of disinformation in the media and spinning this in a negative way, are there not any powerful people in the world trying to go with the positive and true and correct information?
No, because the ones who would have that view are not cleared to access. This is the sine qua non of access. When I was briefing Lord Hill Norton, who was a 5-star admiral, a Sea Lord, had been Ministry of Defense head in the United Kingdom and on the head of the military committee for NATO. And he got very interested in this. He made speeches on the floor of the House of Lords and what have you in the United Kingdom about this issue in UFOs. But he never had access, so I went to his home in Hampshire, and he wanted me to bring the presidential briefing packet, so I did. And he says, I want to know why I was never told this the whole time I was head of the Ministry of Defense of one of the Five Eyes, one of the big intelligence gathering countries, the United Kingdom, and also at NATO. And I said, well, let me answer your question with a question. What would you have done, Admiral, if you had found out there was a group of people running illegally that had the solutions to the world's environmental problems and poverty problems, who have been creating endless conflict and war and are planning to create an interplanetary scenario of conflict, and that they have engaged in murder, mayhem, theft, all manner of criminal activities, up to and including drug running and stuff. He says, I wouldn't have stood for it for a bloody minute, and he was just in a lather over it.
Right.
I said, that's why they didn't tell you. I said, they do a soul biopsy. I'm a doctor. I'm going, soul biopsy. I say, they do an assessment of your psychology. And if you're not willing to go along with that agenda, you're going to, at the most, get a few crumbs of information. You're not going to get full access, and you're certainly not going to get any control over the project. So that's the catch-22 of this. The folks who are good folks in government and operations rarely have any real knowledge or access, or they have a little snippet here and there.
Yeah, not enough to do anything.
But not enough to do anything. And they, in particular, even if they're read into it, a president that's read into it in some detail,
Yeah.
if they were to try to intervene and change the direction of those projects, they would basically be told, get lost. We're not taking an order from you. And this, go back to the testimony of our disclosure witnesses, and also Daniel Sheehan, who after Carter was elected, President Carter, he ran on a platform to disclose this information in '76. Now that's what, like 45 years ago. And the outgoing CIA director was George H.W. Bush. And when President Carter asked about this issue, President Bush said, we're not going to tell you anything. You don't have a need to know. And so Carter had to turn to the Congressional Research Service and other people to try to put some information for him. And some of those people approached Daniel Sheehan, the attorney, to look into it. And he got some information. But Carter was never allowed to control this issue. But to my knowledge, no other president had. Now, President Reagan was given a little more information, but Colonel Holman, who was on the interagency committee trying to sell Star Wars, SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, to President Reagan, told me personally before he died that they would go in, they tried to sell this to Carter, and he wouldn't buy, because Carter's a very smart guy. Reagan kind of got manipulated, and they went into the Reagan White House and said, look, we have this threat from outer space. Let's use the Cold War as the reason we need these weapons in space, but it's really so we can fight the aliens. And Reagan took it hook, line, and sinker, which is why you see these speeches like at the UN that's in our documentary.
Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bound. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world.
Well, why do humans always have to be at war to unite? Can we unite in peace and love?
Right.
And someone recently told me, who's associated with the intelligence community, he said, yes, we all know that there's no threat from the aliens. This guy said this flat out. You can't get any money for butterflies and dandelions. I said, what do you mean butterflies and dandelions? And he was referring to the fact, peaceful contact, world peace, all these beautiful things. You can't get defense money. You can't get contractor money. And that's what this is about. You have to scare the hell out of people. You have to scare people. And then the government will authorize more money. Well, that's what they did to Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
So we're trying to correct that dynamic. Obviously, we're the underdog, but it's a fight worth fighting.
It seemed like the only president that may have had any insight would have been Bush Sr., being that he was in the CIA.
Yes, George H.W. Bush
Yeah.
was on the committee. Actually, Dick Cheney is on this committee. Senator John Warner in the Senate was a minor, had a little sliver of it. His son has recently told us in a 3-hour interview. But Senator Cranston was very heavily involved, the old Senator Cranston. I know who a lot of the people are. So, and again, it has nothing to do with their position, but they've been brought up often through the system and then placed here, there, and everywhere. And then they'll lie to their colleagues. One of the ways this works, just to give you a little more detail, is that if you have a senator that is involved, one of his jobs is to turn to his brethren in the Senate, it's a club of 100 people, and say, oh, this isn't true. If it were true, I'd know about it. And they go, oh, okay, because they trust each other. It's like doctor to doctor, lawyer to lawyer, there's a certain peerage. And so that's also how these organizations work. People have these sweeping conspiracy theories. I'll give you another great example. Right after the Disclosure Project, I was in San Francisco doing an event, and there was the Bohemian Grove up in Northern California was having a meeting that was called, and a man who came to the meeting I held had been at the Bohemian Grove meeting. And he was a very well-off European financier and what have you. And he said, this issue came up at the Bohemian Grove, and someone got up in front of the whole crowd of all these elites and said, I've been with the government for decades. None of this is true, and if it were true, I would know about it. You can trust me. I'm one of your fellow Bohemian Grove people, and just trust me that this is all, just made up nonsense that Dr. Greer is saying. And it worked for most of them. But this guy came to my meeting and said, it doesn't square with what I see that you put out. There's too many corroborating top secret witnesses and documents. I said, yes. I mean, those people are placed in your organization to deceive the rest of you. And so that's true of all these organizations. People talk about the Bilderbergers, and even in those groups, 90% of the people involved would have no clearance into this. And the few that do are embedded to lie to their
They've been
brethren.
infiltrated.
Yes.
Yeah, their own secret society has been infiltrated.
Yes. Very, very effective. Yes.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow, that's very enlightening. So, Dr. Greer, you had expressed earlier in the interview that, at one point, it seemed like your team was being attacked. Mm-hmm. And then afterwards, you had taken a little bit of outside help. Mm-hmm. And so now, after all this has happened, do you think that you're being assisted by some outside forces, or is there any other assistance that you're still getting at this time?
Well, certainly there are multiple layers of support. There are people who are in these classified projects who very much are appalled, like Bill Colby was, at what's going on, who are supportive. There are people who aren't in those unacknowledged projects who are in senior positions in government and other places who are also very supportive. The extraterrestrial civilizations are very supportive, I'm certain of that. And we have the support of the public. And then there's, the level that I'm not a religious person, but I'm very spiritually oriented. And I know that there are, celestial and beings from other higher dimensions that are very, very protective and supportive. With all that, I've never done this thinking that I could get out of it alive. I've always assumed that there's a very good chance I won't. And the main way that they've been able to contain what we're doing is through defamation of character, marginalization, endless public attacks, and also blacklisting. So, I've been blacklisted from a lot of the major media because I won't stick to the script of, we don't know what these things are. Those are people who do that. I don't want to name names, but if you see them on the news, those are people that they will allow to speak because they're basically telling half-truths that are worse than a lie. So I think that's the most effective way. They realized they couldn't do it tactically, where they just flat out kill us. But if they can do it this other way, it's quite effective in many ways. So it's frustrating. I mean, it's this iterative, long-term, it's an ultra marathon that we're doing.
Yeah.
So.
Dr. Greer, thank you for this interview.
Thank you.
I am Billy Carson. Thank you for watching Disclosure with Dr. Stephen Greer.